On June 26, 1243, on a barren stretch of land known as Koz Dag, the Beardless Mountain, one of the most decisive battles in history unfolded. It wasn't supposed to be close. On one side stood nearly 80,000 soldiers, Seljuk cavalry, armored knights from Europe, seasoned infantry from across the Middle East. A coalition built to stop a force that seemed unstoppable. On the other side, just 30,000 Mongol horsemen. By midday, the larger army had ceased to exist. Not weakened, not scattered, gone. What happened on that field wasn't just a military defeat, it was a total collapse. Command broke down. Units fled. Entire divisions were surrounded and erased with terrifying precision. The Mongols didn't just win. They dismantled an entire system in a matter of hours. But here's where the story takes a turn no one at the time could have imagined. Because the Mongols didn't come with a long-term vision for Anatolia. They didn't plan to build, govern, or stabilize. They came to dominate, and in doing so, they shattered the one structure holding the region together. And out of that chaos, something unexpected began to take shape. A small, nearly invisible power. A frontier warlord. A name no one would have bothered to remember. That name was Osman. The empire his descendants would build would go on to conquer Constantinople, dominate 3 continents, and shape global history for over 6 centuries. So here's the question. How does a crushing victory become the beginning of something far more powerful and far more lasting than anything the victors intended? To understand just how catastrophic the events of 1243 truly were, you have to look at what existed before everything fell apart. Because the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was not a fragile state waiting to collapse. It was, by every meaningful measure, a thriving power at its peak. For nearly 2 centuries, the Seljuks had dominated Anatolia, the vast peninsula that once formed the heart of the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire. In fact, the name Rum itself comes from Rome, a deliberate claim. The Seljuks didn't see themselves as outsiders. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to Roman Anatolia, inheritors of its land, its wealth, and its strategic importance. And they had earned that position through force. After their decisive victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, they pushed Byzantine power back toward Constantinople and firmly established control over the region. By the early 13th century, their capital, Konya, had become one of the great cities of the medieval world. This wasn't a frontier outpost, it was a hub of commerce, culture, and political power. Merchants moved through its markets carrying silk from China and spices from India. Architects built mosques and caravanserais with intricate geometric designs that still stand today. Scholars, poets, and officials operated within a system that was stable, organized, and deeply connected to the wider world. This was not a kingdom in decline. It was a system that worked. Which makes the leadership at the time all the more critical. In 1243, the Seljuk throne was held by Sultan Kaykhosro II, a ruler who inherited strength but lacked the discipline to manage it. Where his predecessors had relied on careful diplomacy, balancing tribute with strategic resistance, Kaykhosro leaned toward pride and impulse. He ruled with the confidence of someone who had never truly been tested, and in a world that was rapidly changing, that kind of leadership was dangerous. Because to the east, something far more powerful than any regional kingdom had already begun to reshape the map. The Mongol Empire was not just expanding, it was accelerating. Within a few decades, it had become the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Entire civilizations had already been erased. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a dominant force in Central Asia, had been annihilated so completely that it barely lingered in memory. Cities that resisted were burned. Populations were slaughtered or enslaved. The stories arriving in Anatolia weren't exaggerated, they were warnings. And yet, for a time, the Seljuks had managed to avoid direct conflict. There was an uneasy arrangement in place. The Seljuks paid tribute, gold, goods, and symbolic submission in exchange for peace. It wasn't ideal, but it was practical. It bought time. It maintained stability. And most importantly, it kept the Mongols at a distance. But systems like that depend on restraint from both sides. When Mongol leadership in the region changed, so did the tone. The new general, Baiju Noyan, wasn't interested in maintaining a balanced relationship. His demands went far beyond tribute. He required personal submission. He expected the Seljuk ruler to present himself before the Great Khan, to offer hostages from his own family, and to accept direct Mongol oversight within his government. This wasn't diplomacy. It was domination. And for Kakisra too, accepting those terms would have meant losing not just authority, but legitimacy in the eyes of his own court. Refusing them, however, meant something far worse. War with the most efficient military machine the world had ever seen. At that point, the outcome wasn't guaranteed, but the collision was. The shift from uneasy peace to inevitable war didn't happen all at once. It escalated, step by step, driven by decisions that, in hindsight, feel almost unavoidable. At the center of it all was a man who understood exactly how power worked in the Mongol world: Baiju Noyan. When Baiju took command in the region, he didn't continue the cautious balance his predecessor had maintained. He issued demands designed not just to secure obedience, but to enforce submission. The Seljuk Sultan, Kakisra II, was ordered to personally travel to the Mongol court and kneel before the Great Khan. He was expected to send members of his own family as hostages and accept Mongol officials inside his government, men who would monitor decisions, collect taxes, and report directly back to the empire's center of power. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a test, and Kakisra failed it. From a modern perspective, his refusal might seem predictable, even necessary. No ruler could accept those terms without losing authority in the eyes of his own people. But strategically, it was a miscalculation of the highest order. The Mongols didn't bluff. They didn't posture. When they issued an ultimatum, it came with a built-in expectation: comply or be erased. The first sign of what that meant came in the winter of 1242, when Baiju's forces moved against the city of Erzurum. It was one of the Seljuk Sultanate's key eastern strongholds, a fortified center meant to absorb pressure from exactly this kind of threat. When Mongol envoys arrived with a simple offer, surrender or be destroyed, the city's governor chose defiance. Not just refusal, but open insult. It was the worst possible response. The Mongols laid siege with mechanical patience. They brought siege engines capable of breaking walls that had stood for generations. They cut off supply lines, isolated the city, and waited. After 2 months, Erzurum fell. What followed wasn't just a victory, it was a message. The population was massacred. The city was stripped, burned, and reduced to rubble. Survivors carried the story westward, spreading fear faster than any army could march. Baiju didn't rush forward after that. He didn't need to. He understood something fundamental about human behavior. Once pride is challenged, response becomes inevitable. And Kakisra, facing pressure from his court and the humiliation of inaction, did exactly what Baiju expected. He mobilized. Messengers were sent across the region, calling in alliances and favors. What formed in response was, on paper, an impressive force. Troops arrived from neighboring states, mercenaries from distant lands, and elite units from across the Islamic world. By the time the army assembled, it numbered close to 80,000 men, a massive coalition built to stop the Mongols once and for all. But numbers can be deceptive, because what Kakisra had built wasn't a unified army. It was a collection of different forces stitched together under pressure. These men didn't share a language. They didn't train together. They didn't operate under a single, cohesive command structure. Orders had to be translated, sometimes more than once, losing clarity at every step. Loyalty varied. Some fought for faith, others for gold, and some simply because they had been called. It looked powerful from a distance. Up close, it was fragile. And within that massive force, almost invisible against the scale of events, was a small detail that would matter far more than anyone realized at the time. Among the many Turkish tribal groups that answered the call was a minor leader named Ertugrul. He commanded only a small band, hardly worth mentioning in the grand calculations of war. No historian at the time would have marked his presence as significant, but history doesn't always reveal its turning points in the moment they happen. Ertugrul's son, Osman, would one day build something out of the chaos that followed. something no one in that coalition army could have imagined. As the Seljuk forces began their march across Anatolia, the stage was set. One side had overwhelming numbers but hidden weaknesses. The other had fewer men, but unmatched discipline and a system refined through decades of conquest. The collision wasn't just coming. It had already been decided. The night before the battle, the two armies camped within miles of each other, separated not by distance, but by mindset. In the Seljuk camp, confidence mixed dangerously with tension. Fires burned across a sprawling sea of tents as soldiers from different lands prepared in their own ways. Some prayed, others boasted, many simply tried to quiet the unease they couldn't quite explain. They believed in their numbers. 80,000 men felt like certainty. Across the valley, the Mongol camp was almost unnervingly calm. There were no speeches, no displays of bravado. Just routine. Horses were checked, bowstrings tested, arrows counted. Every man knew his role, and every unit functioned as part of a system that had been refined across decades of relentless warfare. This wasn't just an army, it was a machine. At dawn, that difference began to matter. The Seljuk forces advanced first, a massive formation pushing forward across open ground. From a distance, it looked unstoppable, a wall of cavalry, infantry, and armored knights moving with purpose. But beneath that surface was a critical flaw. There was no unified control strong enough to manage a force of that size and diversity. And then, before the main battle had even begun, everything started to unravel. On the Seljuk right wing, a commander eager for glory, or perhaps unwilling to wait, made a decision that would define the entire battle. Without orders, without coordination, he launched a full-scale charge with roughly 20,000 men. Cavalry surged forward, joined by heavily armored knights convinced they could break the Mongol line through sheer force. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The Mongols began to retreat. But it wasn't panic. It was design. They pulled back in perfect formation, drawing the charging force deeper into open ground, stretching their lines, isolating them from the rest of the army. And as they moved, they turned in their saddles and fired, arrows released with precision, even at full speed. Horses fell first, collapsing under their riders. Momentum turned into chaos as bodies piled up and formations broke apart. Still, the Seljuk forces pushed forward, convinced victory was within reach. That's when the trap closed. Mongol units that had remained hidden moved in from both flanks, sealing the gap behind the charging force. In a matter of minutes, 20,000 men found themselves surrounded. Arrows came from every direction, relentless and disciplined. There was no clear target, no single enemy to engage, just constant pressure, constant loss. What followed wasn't a fight. It was systematic destruction. Attempts to regroup failed. Cavalry couldn't hold position under sustained fire. Knights who tried to break out found their horses targeted, leaving them stranded and vulnerable. Within hours, that entire wing, 1/4 of the Seljuk army, was effectively gone. And the rest of the army had watched it happen. From the center, commanders hesitated. Orders became unclear. Momentum stalled. What had been confidence began to shift into doubt. And yet, instead of pulling back and reassessing, the Sultan ordered the advance to continue. It was a decision driven less by strategy and more by fear. Fear that retreat would shatter what remained of morale. When the main forces finally collided, the fighting was brutal and chaotic. For a time, it even seemed balanced. Infantry pushed forward, cavalry clashed in close combat, and certain units, especially the Georgian contingents, held their ground with discipline and skill. But the Mongols had something the Seljuks didn't: control. They rotated units in and out of combat, maintaining pressure without exhausting their forces. They adapted in real time, shifting tactics as the situation evolved. And as the battle dragged on under the heat of the Anatolian sun, cracks began to spread through the Seljuk lines. Then came the breaking point. Turkmen units, never fully loyal to the Seljuk command, began to defect. Some surrendered. Others simply rode off the field. Mercenaries, sensing the shift, followed. Each departure widened the gaps, and the Mongols exploited every opening with precision. What had been a battle turned into a collapse. At the center, The Sultan's personal guard made a final stand, forming a defensive ring around him as the situation spiraled out of control. But even that couldn't hold. Arrows found their targets. The royal banner fell. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. The Sultan broke. He turned and fled. Once he did, the rest followed. Whatever structure remained dissolved instantly. What had begun as an organized army became a mass of individuals trying to survive. The field was left to the Mongols. By midday, it was over. Not just the battle, but the system that had held Anatolia together for generations. What happened after the battle mattered far more than the battle itself. When the dust settled at Köz Dag, the scale of destruction became impossible to ignore. Tens of thousands of Seljuk soldiers were dead, cut down in the field, trampled in retreat, or left to die where they fell. The exact number will never be known, but even conservative estimates point to a loss so severe that it effectively decapitated the military strength of an entire empire in a single day. The battlefield didn't look like a place of victory or defeat. It looked like the end of something, and in many ways it was. The Mongols moved quickly to turn that victory into control. They advanced deeper into Anatolia with little resistance, because there was no longer a force capable of stopping them. Cities that once operated under a strong centralized system now faced a new reality: submission or destruction. The terms imposed were not subtle. The Seljuk Sultan was allowed to keep his title, but it was little more than symbolic. Real authority shifted to Mongol-appointed officials who oversaw taxation, administration, and political decisions. A heavy tribute system was enforced. Gold, livestock, textiles, and human labor were extracted at levels designed not just to sustain Mongol dominance, but to weaken any possibility of resistance. It wasn't just about control, it was about ensuring that the Seljuks could never rebuild what they had lost. But here's the critical mistake the Mongols didn't recognize. They had broken the system, but they didn't replace it. The Seljuk Sultanate had functioned as more than just a government. It was a framework that held Anatolia together. It regulated power, managed conflict, and kept local leaders in check. When that structure collapsed, it didn't create stability under Mongol rule. It created a vacuum. And vacuums don't stay empty. Across Anatolia, local warlords, known as beyliks, began to emerge. Some were former Seljuk officials. Others were tribal leaders who had never fully integrated into the centralized system. Now, with no strong authority above them, they carved out territories of their own. Small at first, often fragile, but independent. On paper, many of them still acknowledged the Seljuk Sultan. In practice, that loyalty meant very little. Power had become decentralized, fluid, and constantly shifting. Alliances formed and dissolved quickly. Borders changed. Control was measured not by titles, but by who could hold ground and defend it. This fragmentation wasn't temporary, it became the defining condition of the region. At the same time, the Mongols themselves weren't interested in micromanaging every corner of Anatolia. Their strategy relied on dominance, not detailed governance. As long as tribute flowed and rebellion was suppressed, they were satisfied. That left significant gaps in authority, spaces where local leaders could experiment, expand, and adapt without constant interference. What emerged was a political landscape unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of a single, dominant power, Anatolia became a patchwork of competing states, each operating under its own rules, its own leadership style, and its own ambitions. It was unstable. It was unpredictable. But it was also full of opportunity. Because in environments like that, size doesn't always determine success. Structure, adaptability, and positioning matter more. The old rules, the ones that had defined power under the Seljuks, no longer applied. New systems were being built in real time, shaped by conflict, necessity, and ambition. This is the point where the story shifts. What began as a story about destruction now becomes a story about emergence. The fall of centralized authority didn't just end an empire, it created the conditions for something entirely new to rise. Not immediately and not obviously, but inevitably. Because once the old order is gone, something else always takes its place. In the decades after the collapse of Seljuk authority, Anatolia didn't immediately produce a dominant power. Instead, it became a crowded field of small, competing states, each one trying to survive, expand, and define its place in a fractured landscape. Most of them looked similar on the surface: limited resources, regional influence, and constant pressure from neighbors. But one of them, almost unnoticed at first, occupied a position that gave it a quiet advantage. That state was led by a man named Osman. Osman's territory sat along the Byzantine frontier, a zone that was both unstable and full of opportunity. To his west lay lands that had once been firmly controlled by the Byzantine Empire, but by the late 13th century, that control had weakened dramatically. The Byzantines were no longer the dominant force they had once been. Internal struggles, economic strain, and the lingering effects of earlier invasions had reduced their ability to defend distant territories. What remained was a border that looked less like a line of defense and more like an open invitation. Osman understood this. Rather than competing directly with stronger Turkish neighbors deeper inside Anatolia, he focused outward. Raids into Byzantine lands brought not just wealth, but momentum. Success attracted followers. Followers increased military strength. And with that came the ability to hold territory, not just raid it. This wasn't rapid expansion, it was deliberate, consistent growth. Over time, Osman and his successors began absorbing nearby beyliks, either through alliances or conquest. Each gain added not just land, but structure. What started as a small frontier principality began to evolve into something more organized, more stable, and more ambitious. The turning point came with the capture of Bursa in 1326. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. Bursa became the first major capital of what was now clearly more than a regional power. From there, the expansion continued. Nicaea fell in 1337, a city with deep historical and symbolic significance, once central to the Byzantine world. Then came the move that changed everything. By the mid-14th century, Ottoman forces crossed into Europe. What had begun as a small border state in a fragmented Anatolia was now expanding across continents. Step by step, territory by territory, the Ottomans were building something larger than anyone in 1243 could have predicted. Not through sudden dominance, but through positioning, timing, and the opportunities created by chaos. More than a century after the Seljuks were shattered at Köz Dag, history seemed ready to repeat itself, almost perfectly. In 1402, the rising Ottoman Empire faced a force that looked strikingly familiar. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, had rebuilt a vast empire across Central Asia and claimed the legacy of the Mongols. His army moved with the same speed, the same discipline, and the same brutal efficiency that had once dismantled entire civilizations. When he marched into Anatolia, he wasn't just invading territory, he was stepping into a pattern that had already played out before. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid I, rode out to meet him near Ankara with a massive army. The confidence was there. The numbers were there. From a distance, it looked eerily similar to 1243, a powerful regional empire confronting a battle-tested steppe war machine. And then the same mistakes began to surface. Timur didn't rush the fight. He controlled the pace, stretched the battlefield, and forced the Ottomans into positions they couldn't sustain. His forces used mobility and ranged attacks to wear down their opponents, avoiding direct confrontation until the moment was right. And just like at Köz Dag, internal fractures began to appear at the worst possible time. Turkic contingents within the Ottoman army, sharing cultural and linguistic ties with Timur's forces, started to defect. Units that were supposed to hold the line simply switched sides. What had been a unified army began to break apart from within. Confusion spread. Command weakened. Momentum shifted. The result was decisive. Bayezid was captured, becoming the only Ottoman sultan ever taken prisoner. The empire he had built didn't just lose a battle, it fractured. What followed was a period of civil war, with rival claimants fighting for control. Territories broke away. Authority dissolved. For a moment, it looked exactly like what had happened to the Seljuks generations earlier. But this is where the story diverges. The Seljuks never recovered. Their system collapsed, and nothing replaced it at scale. The Ottomans, however, adapted. After years of internal conflict, they reassembled under a single, rebuilding their structure with greater centralization and control. They learned from the collapse instead of being defined by it. Where the Seljuks had fragmented permanently, the Ottomans used the crisis as a reset, emerging more disciplined, more resilient, and ultimately more dangerous. The pattern repeated, but the outcome changed. Today, if you stood on the quiet fields where the Battle of Khos Dag once unfolded, you wouldn't see monuments or crowds. There are no grand reminders of what happened there, just open land, ordinary and almost forgettable. And yet, that forgotten place became one of the most important turning points in world history. Because what happened in 1243 didn't just end a battle, it reshaped the future. The Mongols achieved exactly what they intended in the short term. They broke a powerful empire, imposed control, and secured dominance. But in doing so, they also removed the very structure that had kept an entire region stable. And when that structure disappeared, something inevitable followed: a power vacuum. And power vacuums don't stay empty. They invite ambition. They reward adaptability. They create space for new players to rise, often from places no one is paying attention to. That's exactly what happened in Anatolia. Out of fragmentation came experimentation. Out of instability came opportunity. And from that environment, the Ottoman Empire emerged, not because it was planned, but because the conditions made it possible. That's the deeper lesson here. History isn't always shaped by intention. Sometimes, it's shaped by consequences no one sees coming. The Mongols won the battle, but they set in motion a chain of events that would eventually produce one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. An empire that would influence Europe, the Middle East, and beyond for centuries. That's the irony. And it's also the pattern. If you found this story insightful, make sure to subscribe and join the channel. We break down the hidden turning points of history, the moments that quietly changed everything.